The next speaker is Dr. Kathryn Bradbury from the University of Auckland, although we still view Kathryn as our Otago colleague, as she completed all of her nutrition degrees, including her PhD here at the University of Otago in the Human Nutrition Department. And then following her PhD, Kathryn spent the next 5 years at the University of Oxford, working in the Cancer Epidemiology Unit, investigating the role of diet and disease in large population studies. So she is here today to speak about population food choices and some of the emerging methods to assess diet in these large cohort studies. So please join me in welcoming Kathryn. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. It's great to be back in Dunedin and the familiar aroma of the Greg's coffee. I noticed that straight away. Okay, so as Lisa said, I'm going to be talking about mostly more about emerging methods used to assess diet in prospective cohort studies. So I'm going to start by just reviewing what it is we want from a dietary assessment method in large cohort studies, and I'm going to briefly talk about the traditional method that's been used before moving on to talk about more emerging web-based methods and finishing up with the New Zealand situation. So I think the thing really to keep front of mind when we're thinking about a dietary assessment method in cohort studies is that we really need the cohort study to be extremely large. So that has implications when we're thinking about choosing what kind of method we want. But the study sample does not need to be nationally or demographically representative. If we're, for example, interested in looking at the relationships between fibre and health outcomes, what we want to do is recruit a large sample of people who have a wide range of fibre intakes. And primarily we're interested in discriminating between those with high and low intakes of fibre. So we really want to think about a method that has minimal participant burden because we want a large number of people to complete it with a wide range of dietary intakes, and ideally a method that has no manual data entry on behalf of the researcher, and they don't have to manually code nutrients because that's not feasible in a large sample. But we do want to be able to capture usual measure of usual dietary intakes for participants. So that can either be through one administration of a dietary assessment method or potentially through multiple administrations of, say, a 24-hour recall. And also to keep in mind that Ros mentioned a little bit about remeasurement, but we need to remeasure dietary intakes on at least a subsample. We don't want to have the situation where we are just measuring at baseline and then following up for disease 20 years later without remeasuring in between. So in terms of traditional methods, this is the 1980s Nurses' Health Study Food Frequency Questionnaire. I'm sure the most famous food frequency questionnaire, and I think everyone will know what a food frequency questionnaire is in this room, but it has the list of foods on the left-hand side and the frequency across. So participants just choose for each of these items how frequently they consumed it over the average use over the last year. And you can see that this is the 2015 Nurses' Health Study too, and really this method in 35 years is almost exactly the same. The only difference really is the frequency has changed now to be less frequent on the left-hand side, more frequent, and it's been designed so that it can be scanned for automatic data entry. And I just want to pull up the Harvard Pulling Project to demonstrate the dominance of this pen and paper food frequency questionnaire. This is a pulling project which is aimed to combine or pull all the data that's available on diet and cancer, and a cohort is eligible to participate if they have used a validated dietary assessment method and they can link to cancer outcomes. So 39 cohorts participate altogether, and virtually all of these have used a pen and paper food frequency questionnaire as their primary method of dietary assessment. So really the whole body of nutritional epidemiology literature is really built on this method. I want to just dive a little deeper into EPIC, which is one of the studies that I worked on, and it was mentioned a few times yesterday. It sometimes contributes data to the Harvard Pooling Project. And it's a cohort of 500,000 men and women, adults, recruited from 23 centres in 10 European countries. And I worked in the EPIC Oxford Centre, and there was another UK centre as well, run out of Cambridge. And this is the food frequency questionnaire that was used in the UK centres. It's your bog standard pen and paper food frequency questionnaire. It wasn't actually designed to be scanned, but then the technology advanced that it was able to be scanned, so they didn't have to manually enter the data. Each country in EPIC did their own specific food frequency questionnaire, but then what they did was take a random subsample of about 8%, so just over 35,000 participants from across the centres to try to calibrate intakes across countries. And I know that most people would have heard of the EPIC study, but I'm not sure that as many people are aware that the Million Women study has collected dietary information. So this is a cohort of 1.3 million women, as the name suggests, and they were recruited at the end of the 1990s when they went for a breast cancer screening by completing a 4-page questionnaire. At baseline, there was no information on diet, but about 3 years after recruitment, another questionnaire, 4 pages, was sent out to the women, and 700,000 women completed this questionnaire. So this actually makes the Million Women study the single largest cohort with dietary information available. And a large number of women did this study. It was set up actually to look at the effects of hormone therapy for menopause and breast cancer and other health outcomes. And it was a question that a lot of women wanted answered. And so actually a quarter of the women who were in the right age range actually are in the Million Women study, which is phenomenal. So this is the dietary questionnaire that was sent out about 3 years after recruitment. So it took up about 1 page of this 4-page questionnaire. And it's sort of a food frequency questionnaire, but not as we know it. It this is an example of a question. So it sort of asks, what types of meat do you eat about once a week or more often? And the participant chooses from the list what types of meat they eat. Same for fish. And then down here it asks, about how many times each week do you eat meat, or fish, and then other foods? It's available on the website if you want to have a closer look at all the questions. We are able to program nutrients out of this and energy intakes, and we have tested the reproducibility up to 2 years apart, and it is good. And it's also been validated with 7-day dietary records, and the median correlation between the yellow dietary questionnaire and the 7-day diet records is 0.48. For calcium and fibre, the correlations are higher than 0.6. And if you're not familiar with typical validation correlations, they're usually between about 0.4 and 0.7. Alcohol, the correlation is 0.75. That's always measured very well. So I'm going to move on now to talk about emerging methods. And I'm going to use UK Biobank as an example of a cohort that has used some emerging methods. So they've used a touchscreen dietary questionnaire, and they've also used the Oxford WebQ, which is a 24-hour dietary assessment method. I have a disclaimer that it's not a true recall because some people hate it if we refer to it as that. And I'm also going to just, for comparison, show 3 other more 24-hour web-based recalls that more mimic a traditional interviewer-led 24-hour recall. So this is the study design of UK Biobank. It's a cohort of 500,000 men and women from the UK, aged 40 to 70. Everyone in the study went to an assessment centre at recruitment, so they got a blood sample taken, a wide range of physical measures, and they also completed a really long touchscreen questionnaire, which contained 30 questions about diet. So all 500,000 did this touchscreen questionnaire with 30 questions on diet. Then about a year after recruitment finished, every participant who left a valid email address was emailed up to 4 times over the course of a year an invitation to complete the Oxford WebQ, which is a 24-hour dietary assessment. So this is the numbers of people who did it in each cycle. So around 100,000, although slightly less than the second cycle. And this was to try to get an idea of a bit of seasonal variation. So this is what the questionnaire looks like. This is the touchscreen questionnaire that all 500,000 did at recruitment. So for example, this says, how often do you eat beef? Do not count processed meats. And then the participant just touches, which of these options corresponds to them. So it is really a food frequency questionnaire, but with a different format, with 1 page per food item. And this is another example of what they asked for fruit. Again, it asks how many pieces of fresh fruit would you eat per day? And it gives an example of what you should count as a portion. And then you are to enter, using these touchscreen numbers, how many pieces you ate. And the good thing about this, as opposed to a pen and paper food frequency questionnaire where you don't have any controls over what they write or if their page is stuck together and they've missed a whole page, this you can control and have limits on the participant answers. So for UK Biobank, they were quite generous with their limits because they wanted to make sure that anyone with an extreme but vaguely plausible diet could enter their true diet. So they gave a limit of 50 for fresh fruit, for example. So, if you're on some kind of extreme juicing fruit diet, you could still have a valid record. So their approach was to choose very generous limits. This is what the Oxford Web Queue looks like. So this was administered up to 4 times over a year, and people were invited via email to complete this. It aims to capture all the food and drink consumed in the previous 24 hours. So how it works is it starts with sort of general food groups. So this one is, did you eat any breads or crackers yesterday? If you say yes, then the other information drops down. So you can choose what type of bread. If you select that you did have 2 slices of sliced bread, it then drops down and said, what was the flour type? Was there any seeds in it? And then because you've said that, it also prompts and says, did you have any butter or margarine on your bread? How many had butter or margarine? What was this? How thickly did you spread it? What was the kind of butter? So these are just snapshots, not the whole page that you see. But so it kind of, depending on your answers, you get more or less food sort of showing. And it includes over 200 foods and over 40 beverages. And it has been compared in a comparison study to an interviewer-led 24-hour recall performed on the same day in over 100 people. The interviewer-led 24-hour recall took 30 minutes to complete and an extra 30 minutes for the researcher to code it, whereas the Oxford Web Queue took 12 and a half minutes to self-complete. So you can see that for the participant, the burden is halved, and for the researcher, the burden is eliminated once you have developed the tool. And the agreement between the interviewer-led recall and the Oxford Web Queue was good for most nutrients. But I just want to talk about what happened when it was administered in the UK Biobank study. So if you remember, it was administered up to 4 times, 4 cycles. There was a bit of discussion about how long you would give people to complete, to do it. So when it was emailed out, the first couple of cycles, they were given 3 days before the email link expired, whereas in the last 2 cycles, they were given 14 days before the email link expired. And what they didn't want to happen was to email out a link to do a diet survey and people think, oh great, I got that in the morning, I'll eat perfectly the rest of the day and then complete it tomorrow. So if you combine all the cycles, about 58% completed it on the same day that they were emailed, and about 20% or so completed it on the next day. But what this hides, so this is showing that, so the same day here is in green, if they complete it on the same day, the next day or later on. But what it hides is what happened between weekdays and weekend days. So on weekdays, 78% of people completed it on the same day they were sent it. If they were sent it in the weekend, only 23% completed it on the day they were sent it. So this has implications if you're trying to get a good spread of weekend days, and just that you don't necessarily have as much control over when people do it. And I also just want to point out that about 100,000 did it sort of at each time point, but these are not always the same people. So in total, 210,000 have at least 1 record, 125,000 completed at least 2, and then it drops off to 80,000 have done at least 3. So when you're trying to get people to do multiple times, you really do get a drop-off in sample size. I just want to show a little bit about what we did with this data. This is UK Biobank. It's stuff that's under review at the moment on meat and colorectal cancer. Well, the paper's on diet, but this is meat. So what we did is we looked at what people said at the touchscreen, how often they said they consumed red and processed meat. We categorised all 500,000 participants according to what they said at the touchscreen questionnaire at baseline. And then we used those people who had done, the large subsample actually, who have done at least one Oxford WebQ, a 24-hour dietary assessment, to get an estimate of the mean intake within each category. So for those at baseline who said that they ate red and processed meat twice a week or less, we looked at those in that category who had done it in Oxford WebQ, and the average intake of red and processed meat was 21 grams. And you can see that we did that for each category. We also used it to get an idea of the trend, and the result over here, ooh, this doesn't look so good, is so for every 50-gram increment in red and processed meat intake, there was a 17% increased risk in colorectal cancer. So I just want to, for comparison, just show you a little bit about what some of the other emerging methods look like. All these three methods I'm going to show you more closely mimic an interviewer-led 24-hour recall. So this is the ASA-24, which was developed by the National Cancer Institute, but it has been adapted for use in Canada and Australia. You select a meal or snack at the start and the time, and then, I've done something funny here. After that, there's also questions about whether you ate it with people or you were watching a screen. You do a quick list here where you enter, for example, that you ate toast. Then it goes on to get more detail about what kind of toast it was. You have photos to decide which kind of the amount. This is the Intake 24, which was developed by Newcastle University for use in national nutrition surveys, actually. And it is a meal-based dietary assessment method. You can see in the box on the top left that you sort of have a set meal pattern, although you can change it, but initially it's set. You put the timing of your meals. Again, you choose your foods. It asks you to match them from a list, and this one gives you a variety of photos, and you choose the slice of bread that most looks like the one you consumed. The My Food 24 is the last one I'm going to show you, which is developed from Leeds. It is, again, a meal-based pattern. The thing about this one is that it has snacks here, but they're all combined. So if someone fills it out, you can't tell if they've had 5 snacks or 1. They all go into the same slot. And when you enter the foods, I also find here, you enter toast, and it says here it found 120 items. So it's like searching through food composition database, really. The first thing that comes up is almonds toasted, but luckily bread comes up under that. So you have to choose your matching food. And again, then you choose what kind of slice you had. Usually it's just text description, but sometimes there are photos. So I did a comparison where I completed 4 days of my own diet record using each of these. So each day I did used each of these 4 methods to record my day, starting with a different method on each day. It's a little n=1 comparison. And it took between about a minute and 4 minutes to read all the instructions for each of these. But the ASA-24 takes about twice as long as the others to complete, 20 minutes. And it was, in places, really tedious. And what was tedious was it asked you for every drink of water, whether you were watching a screen or you got it from the supermarket. And so it was that kind of contextual information that was really quite tedious. The Intake 24 I quite like this one. The meal pattern is initially fixed, and also the final review was quite easy to skip, whereas the other ones really forced you to look at what you'd said your diet was. I don't think the My Food 24 has any advantage really over the Intake 24 because all the snacks are combined, and it's really can be difficult to find your food. Oxford WebQ, I'm more familiar with that, so it's probably quicker for me. Of course, none of these are. The target audience isn't someone with a PhD in nutrition who has a certain familiarity with food composition tables, but nevertheless, I am a person who eats food, and it is interesting to do it from a participant point of view. But the Oxford WebQ gives you no information about whether you ate all the food in one meal or 5 different meals. So my thoughts on these emerging web-based methods is that the automatic coding is a big advantage, and that it reduces or eliminates really that researcher burden. Most of them that have been developed capture intake in a 24-hour period. If you want to use that for a cohort study or you want to get people to do it multiple times, there does seem to be quite a drop-off in sample size if you're trying to get people to do that. The other thing I haven't mentioned is that they do go out of date quickly and can require quite a lot of sort of periodic updating. And I know that the ASA-24 and the Oxford WebQ have both, when it was developed, was not developed for use on smartphones. They thought people would just do it on a computer. They've both now been optimized for smartphones, but neither of them have been chosen to revalidate. They think that that won't change the validation. But what you see when you do it on a smartphone is actually quite different to what you see on a computer. You don't see the whole screen. So I think it would be reassuring to revalidate it. And just to note again that you don't necessarily have good control over when the participant does it if you're inviting them via email. So I just want to talk briefly about the New Zealand setting. We have a number of what I would call small, because I'm used to these 500,000 cohorts, but small birth cohorts in New Zealand, which are really quite rich resources in terms of the data they collect. And the largest one would be Growing Up in New Zealand of 7,000 participants. About half of these cohorts have done a full frequency questionnaire, but none of them are designed, or they're not designed, and they're also not large enough to really look at the relationships between diet and non-communicable diseases, with the exception of MenSACS, which is a new cohort recruiting people in North Island centres with acute coronary syndromes. It's got 2,000 people so far, but because the event rate is really high in people who've had an acute coronary syndrome, they will be looking at predicting secondary events. But in New Zealand, we actually have very good routinely collected health information. Everyone has a unique health identifier number. We have cancer registrations, mortality registrations, chronic diseases are recorded, even things like pharmaceutical dispensings, and things like, it's all linked to census and justice and housing data even in the IDI. And I want to just bring back up the Harvard Pooling Project. So there's 39 cohorts, 25 of them I think are from North America, and with the exception of the multi-ethnic cohort, which this is supposed to be in Hawaii, I didn't make this map, and the Black Women's Health Study, these are primarily Caucasian participants. There's another 9, I think, cohorts in Europe, which are again European participants, 4 cohorts in Asia, which provide a bit of diversity to the literature. 1 in Australia, but none in New Zealand. We are actually fortunate enough to be included on this map, but we have no cohort that can look at diet and cancer. And I think that we have an ethnically diverse population, and we can actually look at a wealth of outcomes. This is, you can see that it's set up to look at diet and cancer. That's because most of these cohorts can only link to cancer registries. They are now starting to try and look at cardiovascular, but most of them, they're restricted to looking at cardiovascular deaths because they can link to mortality data, but don't have incidence data. So New Zealand, we could look at a lot more outcomes and have a much more diverse sample. So my thoughts are that cohort studies really need to be large, but not representative. I think the web-based methods have many advantages, probably not just for cohort studies. You can use a method that measures usual intake, like the one in UK Biobank, the touchscreen, where they just did it once and you kind of get an idea of what someone's usual intake is, or multiple administrations of a 24-hour method, although that does seem to drop the sample size. But my question is, can we develop or adapt one of these dietary assessment tools and get large numbers of New Zealanders to complete it and link it via the unique health number to the routinely collected health information in the IDI? And that's what I want to be working on over the next few years. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, this is my email address, and please email me.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting, Kathryn. So do we have any questions? I have questions. I always have questions. So in terms of that last comment about it needs to be large but doesn't need to be representative. So if it doesn't need to be representative, perhaps comment on that, but what does it need to be?
Yeah, so it doesn't need to be nationally represented. I was trying to think, because I'm sort of talking about something different to nutrition surveys where you do really want a representative sample. So with the cohorts, what we want is a really large sample with a range of intakes. So if we are looking at fibre and health outcomes, we don't want to get people with, even if the sample is large, if fibre intake doesn't vary very much, we're not going to be able to see if fibre is related to disease. So we want to have people with low fibre intakes and high fibre intakes. So we get that range. So the range, I think, is the most important thing.
I do have one more question, but Well, I love technology, so, and especially as Ross says, the challenges we have in developing countries, it would be nice to have field tools and utilize mobile phones. But when you are using technology, can you comment on perhaps certain groups you'll exclude because of these lovely photos and touch screen tools?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think you probably need to test it in each population. We have used the Oxford WebQ in the Million Women study. I didn't say that, but I think about 50,000 women in the Million Women study have now done it. They're probably the more they're older now. I'd say I can't remember, but I think they're in their 70s, probably most of them. But or might be even older than that. But they're the ones who entered an email address. So obviously they've some kind of, technology. But they've done it fine. It takes them a bit longer than it does younger adults, but they can do it. And we get emails from them. They go and do it at their children's house or go to the library and do it. One person bought a new computer to do it. They're so devoted to being in the study because they feel it answers really important questions on their health. So I think part of, there are, but there's lots probably who don't do it. So I think, you may lose some people, especially if you're doing it via email. Of course, you can get them into a clinic and still do it on a screen, which does still save time and burden. You can get a station of 6 people doing it with one floating person helping. So, that's an option.
Hi, Kathryn.
Hi.
I was just curious, when you had the drop-off rate of down to 35,000 of people who had done all 4 cycles, was there any accounting or adjusting for the fact that those people might have similar characteristics in terms of dietary habits as well? Because usually, if there's a certain type of person who's quite keen to keep taking part in it, or is it that everything, like your samples are big enough that that's going to override that potential effect?
Yeah, we've been talking about this a lot, and with the reviewers. So you definitely get the people who do it 4 times are more likely to be female, actually more likely to be older, more educated, less deprived, what you'd expect. So there is a bias in who you get to do that second measure. We've sort of done some in-house simulations in terms of how we used it in UK Biobank, and using it as a second measure is kind of quite robust to the factors that influence whether people do that second measure. But I guess it's something to think about in what study you're doing. If you want to use one of these, you may get a bias of who completes them, and especially who goes on to complete those second measures. I think you're right,
If you find, as you have done, that there's a very clear relationship between risk of bowel cancer and meat intake, and you showed a very convincing slide of that, do you think that's enough basis for public health policy, or do you think you need to do anything else?
Some people aren't very interested in that because they say we already know that, but then I guess part of the criticism from the meat industry was that lots of those studies that showed meat was related to bowel cancer were done ages ago. We don't eat that kind of meat and all this sort of, I don't know why they think the meat's particularly different. But so this was quite good because its recruitment was 2006 to 2010, so it's kind of contemporary intakes. I guess because we already know some of the mechanistic work. I think just that, without any underlying understanding of the mechanisms, wouldn't be that convincing. But there is a lot of work on the mechanisms, and the nitrosamines, and so I think combined with the epidemiological data, it's quite a convincing picture overall. Do you agree?
Okay, I'll end it there, but I think the next tool is the Snapchat tool with a selfie to show you what they're eating. But anyways, thank you very much once again.